Ok. Muy buenas tardes a todos. Bienvenidos a Bimet un día más, una tarde más. Antes que nada, agradecer a todos los asistentes el haber estado con nosotros en estos días. Hoy es el segundo, seguiremos mañana y el viernes. Ahora os quiero presentar a David Marsh. Voy a hacer su presentación en inglés. Sabéis que esta ponencia va a ser en inglés. Y os voy a explicar primero la dinámica, luego lo voy a presentar y dará comienzo la conferencia de David, ¿vale? La conferencia durará unos 40 minutos y en los 10 últimos minutos podéis hacer las preguntas que queráis. Os las voy a ir anotando y yo se las haré llegar al final para que os las conteste. Entonces voy a ir ahora con la presentación de David Marsh. Good afternoon and welcome to a new BMET session. David Marsh is an international renowned expert on education, innovation, strategy and practice who has contributed to educational advance in Finland over 25 years. Born in Australia, educated in UK, we are delighted to introduce David Marsh with his conference, Signature Pedagogies, which enable inspiration through integration. Thank you, David Marsh, to be with us. Thank you. You can start when you want, okay?
So good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Gustavo, for that introduction. The key word tonight in this presentation is the word integration. And what I'm planning to do is to talk a little bit about what we're seeing now happening in education and how the integration appears to be influencing the future of where quality education is going. Now, what we can see globally is a reshaping of education environments. This is being driven by parents who want something better for their children than the education they had. It's being driven by working life which wants to have young people entering adulthood and entering work with competencies that they didn't have before. And it's being driven by pioneers. It's being driven by people in technology, people in education who say, surely we can do better. And this movement is producing a triangular coming together of synergies from education, from research, and from technologies. And tonight I'm going to tell you the story of this as best I can in the next 35, 40 minutes. Now, the central meaning of the word integration is to do with combining two or more things in an effective way. And it becomes a form of innovation. And innovation is born during times of resistance and during times of crisis. Let me give you an example of integration from the entertainment world. The circus industry some 30 years ago was in crisis. People were no longer going to the big stadiums to watch the clowns and the elephants and the people doing various silly things and running around and making a lot of noise. And so somebody came together, people came together, and they said, what we're going to do is we're going to create an innovative practice. We're going to bring together the best of gymnastics, of acrobatics, of dance, of music, and they created Cirque du Soleil. And what we're seeing now in education are a whole load of examples of very similar experiences where things that exist which are good are brought together in a different way to improve the situation and to break the status quo, which is not good enough. Now, many years ago, I want to talk a little bit about three types of advancement. Well, firstly, with technologies. Many years ago, there was a young man in Helsinki, a student, who probably was saying in Finnish, surely we can do better. This was a person who saw the power of Microsoft, who saw the power of IBM, and who decided surely there's a different way of providing a technological experience, of providing the means and tools to use technology, and Linux was born. Linux was born as a kind of an integrated approach, as a form of resistance against the status quo, because these young people felt that the status quo was not good enough. In terms of the sciences, we have never been able to look inside the brain in the ways in which we can now. We've never had the equipment at a certain cost. We've never had the technological advances to be able to look inside the brain and to have a greater understanding of the mind. And the neurosciences have been feeding information into the world, which is helping with the advancement of education. There are pioneers all over Spain, all over Europe, and globally, who are saying, when they look at schools, when they look at colleges, when they look at the young people in those schools and colleges, surely we can do better. And they have been developing various forms of high impact teaching environments. And one of the characteristics of high impact teaching environments, that work with these young people now, is integration. Again, going back to Cirque du Soleil, it's not so much a matter of inventing something completely new, but it's a matter of taking what already exists and saying, let's package this in a different way in order to make things better and to make things happen in a different way. All over the world, we are experiencing a major cultural shift. And that cultural shift is coming partly from the amount of time spent using digital devices, the amount of time on the cyber highways of young people all around the world. And it's a unique intercultural experience because the digital world is having a similar impact on the children, the young people in Korea, in Japan, in Spain, in Finland, and in Botswana. And it is having a profound impact on the ways in which young people, those young people who are in our schools and in our colleges, and how they think. If you have 30, 40, 50 hours a week of young people using digital devices, which is now increasingly common, if you have children from a very early age using digital devices, which is now increasingly common, if you have young people spending hours multitasking, you know, using one hand for gaming this and another hand for Instagramming and so on, it is understandable that it is having an impact on how these young people read, how they search for information, how they apply knowledge, how they identify with themselves and the paths that they need to take in order to learn. In education, for quite a long time, we've been saying, but this is all causing trouble. This is something that we should recognize as a problem. We've been looking at the mostly negative consequences of this digital world. We've been looking at young people who are not sleeping enough. We're hearing stories, we're getting research that there's an inability to concentrate is increasing, that people are increasingly isolated. We get a lot about the negative experience of the digital world. And of course, that negative experience exists. But there are also parts of this experience which can be positive or can be negative, such as the multitasking, such as wanting to learn through dialogue, not to learn through monologue, such as the kinds of social intelligence which these young people are developing from a very, very early age. And these positives, these are the things that we need to leverage in education. And this is where the marriage between technology and education should be at its strongest. And it is not, for reasons which I will mention in a short while. We clearly have, with Generation Z and Generation Alpha and also older, persons, probably some of whom are watching this presentation now, we clearly have positives coming from that world, that cyber world. And these positives, if we neglect them in education now, we are doing a disservice, not just to the young people and their families and parents, but to our societies. And sadly, although there are many exceptions, which tend to be isolated schools or isolated regions who are run by pioneers in education who say, surely we can do better, sadly, our macro educational systems are very, very slow to respond to the value and the potential of these young people. This was the case before COVID. What COVID has done is to magnify or amplify the negative practices which we had in schools before the pandemic. And now is a very exciting time in terms of not talking so much about the experience of COVID and remote learning and so on, but talking about, let's look at this from a fresh view. Let's look at this situation, just like Linus Torvalds back in the 80s saying, should the world be controlled by these American mega corporations, or can we, young people, produce open source solutions for the good of everybody? And that is the dialogue that is happening right now. We have a situation where the digital literacy of the younger people is such a leap, it's such a big jump that it needs to be matched. It's a generation leap, which needs to be matched by an educational leap in our systems. And we have an opportunity to bring together the intelligence, the creativity, the dynamism that we can see in the technical world. A whole of Europe is full of small and medium-sized enterprises who are producing educational solutions. But there is not enough dialogue between those brilliant young people and the brilliant pioneering people who are passionate about changing educational practice, and the administrations of our countries, of our regions, who are ultimately responsible for enabling innovation to happen. Digital literacy is not a language, but it is different. And one very obvious feature is the power of visualization. It's the power of the brain looking, learning through images, learning through infographics, through pictures, because the brain processes images some 60,000 times faster than it processes the written word. And if you take research which looks at how much do people remember if they sit and listen to a teacher speaking, as I'm doing now, unfortunately, for an hour, how much do they remember after 72 hours? And it could be as little as 10%. But if you combine the visual and the sound together, the percentage increases dramatically to 60, 70%. This kind of understanding of the young people with whom we have responsibility in education is what is driving pioneering schools, pioneering educators, and technical expertise that wants to get into the educational solution sector to look at how to create forms of integration. And I'm going to briefly talk about four types of integration which we can see happening now in leading schools. The first is the simplest, and that is the creation of new subjects. It took a long time for environmental science to become a subject in the curriculum of many regions and many countries. It took many, many years. We have known about the significance of this phenomenon for decades, and yet we have been kind of teaching it a little bit in physics, a little bit in geography, a little bit in chemistry, a little bit in biology. But then teachers are saying, no, stop. This is so significant that it needs to become a new subject of its own. So environmental science is an example of a new integrated area of study, as is coding and programming. Coding and programming, if you look at how innovative systems have embedded this into teaching from a very early age, it's not something completely new. It's taking Cirque du Soleil, things that existed before, it's introducing them formally through the curriculum. So there are intended learning outcomes built in that all children will learn something about coding and programming. And it is one example of how integration is happening in our schools. The second way is to create new ways of learning. I give you one example from language learning. Now, I do apologize that I'm using English here, and I hope it's understandable to all of you out there. But language teaching has failed miserably across Europe for many, many years, for decades. It's failed. If you look at the number of hours that we've been teaching French in the United Kingdom or English in Spain, come on, the results are shockingly poor, considering how much time is invested in it. So there were pioneers in this sector who said, hey, maybe we could do things differently. They looked at the science, they said, aha, the way the person learns a language best is X, Y, and Z. And they created new forms of learning. CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning, is just one example. And if I take you to a country where the learning of English, for example, is very demanding, and this is true right across the whole of Latin America, there are very interesting examples of taking young people whose command of English is very low, whose motivation towards English may be low, whose image of themselves as language learners may be negative. And we see examples of content being put into language teaching because the research is saying it and because it fits with the digital world that those young people in Mexico could access the English language digital world if they so wished. So in Mexico, in a context where it's not that easy to successfully teach large cohorts of young people, we have very interesting examples of new ways of learning both content and learning language, which emanate from CLIL. The third area is what some people call transversals across subjects. It's where you combine elements of different subjects together in a very special way. Now in Finland, and Finland, as you know, has been a high performer in international studies on education for a long time, is one of the highest, most highly regarded countries in the European Union at the moment in terms of access to technology and various forms of technological creativity. What Finland has done is said, you know, we have a problem. In our schools, we're not developing a certain type of intelligence. We're not developing what we call systems learning. I'll explain this in just a moment. So what they introduced now into the Finnish curriculum is a new form of integrated innovation, and they call it phenomenon-based learning. For example, if the students are studying something like lightning, they may study it through the eyes of physics, through the eyes of math, through the eyes of geography, through the eyes of art. But they study the subject from 360s. They actually study it through those subjects very seriously with academic rigor to create something which is essentially an ability to develop systems thinking. And systems thinking is an absolute core competence for it's one of the core parts of what we call global competencies. which now, thanks to many, many organizations and pioneers and so on, and especially now the OECD, is an absolute priority in terms of thinking. Systems thinking is a matter of developing what we call fluid intelligence. Our educational systems have been hijacked by some major powers, and one of those is testing. Testing has been, in the last 20 years, a rapidly growing private sector which has been milking the educational system for various ways. And it is something that has produced standardized testing. And the standardized testing is yesterday's way of testing. If you come to a country like Finland, you'll see that standardized testing is simply not there until almost the end of schooling. Formative testing is, but that's another story. But systems thinking develops fluid intelligence. If we fill the mind of a child with knowledge, and then we put them in a test to test if they've remembered that knowledge, and we don't really care if they forget it 2 or 3 weeks after the test, that's what we call crystallized intelligence. It's almost like the mind of the young person is like an encyclopedia. And that has been a major force in education for many, many years, perhaps for good reason. But now there is a need to combine the fluid intelligence and the crystallized intelligence so that young people are better able to navigate that world out there, which, as we know, is changing so rapidly, and to bring out the best of their existing competencies to navigate that world because of their life in the digital cyberspace and so forth. Now, the fourth area of integration I've called deep dive technological solutions. All over Europe, I see startups, and very often they are being created and led by very brilliant young people. They're being led by the very young people that we're talking about here. So this digital generation is now in adulthood, and many of these people are in the technology sector, and they are working on ways of making a living, and they're working on ways of creating apps and creating various solutions for many things, including education. The potential here is huge in terms of enabling us to have the education leap, which we need to have because, as I said, we have a generation leap. But that technological thinking needs to be done in a way which is hand in hand with those who understand education. And those who understand education are very often, they are the people at the interface. They are actually the people who are actively teaching, who can actually feed that experience of being at the interface through the researchers, through the administrators, and make something better because they are saying, surely we can do better. Unfortunately, in our countries, there's disjuncture, there's a gap between the research world, the administrative world, and the doing world in education. And where you have those three brought together successfully, as in Finland, I would say, then you can see that technology really is supporting education, and it's not pretending to sell things that don't work, and it's not pretending to be something that it's actually not. It's very difficult to navigate the apps and the solutions because they are often detached from the realities of teaching and learning. And these deep dive solutions, we can see, for example, I take one example from Brazil. What I see in one example in Brazil is the following. You have a combination of VR and AR, which is a learning experience of about 15 minutes, right? So the teacher, before COVID, the teacher in the school teaches a subject subject, let's say the planets, for 30 minutes, and then the students take their own devices and they can access through very smart software, they can actually get into a space rocket, fly to Mars, they can have conversations in that space rocket by themselves with their colleagues, they can be free of the teacher, and they can be in a gamified world for 10 minutes, for 15 minutes. Then it's stopped, the devices are put down, and we come back to the teacher to wrap up the lesson and to learn about what happened in that lesson. Sometimes we think that more is better than less. And that is a very, very big mistake for all of us most of the time, whether we're eating chocolate, whether we're eating some delicious food, and whether we're actually in the practice of teaching. What we need from technology and what we're getting in certain quite brilliant solutions is a very targeted package which fits well into the existing educational culture of the environment that those people are in. And it's not something that has to be greater. It's not something that has to be big and, you know, we're going to stop teaching and everybody's going to learn from computers. It needs to be tactical and it needs to be the right type. It needs to be interactive because young people will not learn through monologue. They will not learn through listening. It needs to be inquiry-based. It needs to be challenging. It needs to be immersive because that's the kind of the break world that I'm used to because I game. I'm using gaming. It needs to be intelligent. It's remarkable how often we underestimate the knowledge and the capacity of young people to learn. Just look at textbooks. Just look at textbooks. Perhaps you know of textbooks that are absolutely brilliant. I do in certain subjects, but there are certain subjects where the textbooks underestimate the capacity of the young person to think, to ask questions, because the textbooks are part of a standardized educational philosophy, which is developing crystallized intelligence and not fluid intelligence. Well, this is where the future is, and this is where technology can play a role in providing complementary learning experiences which are innovative and which are intuitive and which young people enjoy most of all, perhaps also teachers. So what I see over the last 20 years is we've had a lot of hype, a lot of promises about how technology will fundamentally change education. We've had a technology sector, which is really process-driven. It's been focused on producing sometimes absolutely wonderful VR, AR solutions. It's been process-driven, but we have an education world which needs to be outcomes-driven. It needs to be looking at the learning outcomes of the students. And those two worlds are not connected as much as they could be. And if there is a boom area in technology, it is to get so close to real education, not to sit in an office producing something fabulous, thinking, well, when I was at school, it was like this, so this is going to work. But actually looking very carefully at who those young people are now, at the pressures that they're under, the teachers are under because of the systems and the tests and so on, and to start a marriage with no plan B. And the solution is in methods. Before the pandemic, we have classrooms all over Europe, which were probably like this. It's 10 o'clock, time to start the class. Teacher walks in, yeah, lovely person, and they start teaching. And their teaching is essentially talking. Now, I'm guilty of that, but I have been trying to combine imaging to scaffold or to support the points that I'm hoping that I'm making clear to you. The future is in methods, and these methods need to be aligned to two things. One is the intended learning outcomes. in this picture, you can see OECD global competence learning outcomes, but they need to be also connected to how young people learn in the digital world, because they are learning all the time, whether they're gaming, whether they're trying to fix their photograph or their profile in Instagram. They are learning skills and they are picking up knowledge. And sometimes that knowledge is not, should I say, factual. So they need to have certain skills urgently, such as critical thinking skills, such as fluid intelligence, so that they can see a mass of information and they can see a path through it. Hopefully, the path which reflects fact and integrity and honesty and creativity. But for that to happen, we need to replicate in our educational system the same types of learning methods which are built in to, for example, forms of gaming. When I was a child at school, I had feedback from my teacher. And quite often it was in red ink at the bottom of an essay. 3 weeks after I'd written the essay, one line saying, C-, do better next time. Yeah, great, thanks a lot. That was feedback. If you look at gaming, it's based on feed forward. It's actually based on here is the situation which you need to quickly analyze in order to know how to move forwards. That is a technique that is absolutely elemental in the technical world, and it is a technique which is found in those leading schools which are looking at how to integrate, how to make things better through looking at what exists that is good and putting it together in a different way. As I said earlier, this appalling period that we're living through with COVID has magnified what we do wrong in education. And that means it does give us an opportunity as educational communities to come together and say, okay, we've been talking for decades about what is good education, but the world has changed. And the world has changed because the change is being driven by many factors, including the potential power of technology, and including the fact that we now understand what successful learning is because of research, particularly from the neurosciences. So it is a time to come together. It is an opportunity. And after the crisis is over, it is very likely that leading schools and leading teachers will say, I'm going to say it again, surely we can do better. And they'll come together and there will be a dialogue which will lead to better solutions. When we look at what is happening out there, which is innovative and which is exciting, I rest my case, it comes back to integration. And on that, I would like to stop this presentation, and I'd be very happy to try to comment or respond to any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you so much for listening to me today.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Your lecture has been a totally master class for all of us. Thank you very much. I have any questions from the assistants? So if you want, we can start with that. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, so let's start with the questions. Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you. So the first question is how to keep the students' attention during a video lesson? How to keep the students' attention during a video lesson? You know, any?
Watching television is one of the least effective ways of somebody learning something. Now, when you say a video lesson, do you mean in remote teaching. Sorry, we're talking about the COVID situation, I suppose.
Yeah.
I guess.
So,
Okay. The research on the COVID situation is very interesting indeed, because the research that has been done in different countries is showing the same results. And there are 12 negatives. There is not a lot of good news about what has happened since March in a lot of countries for many reasons, as we know. But one of the issues is, if I found it difficult to listen to a teacher for a long period of time before COVID, I'm going to find it even more difficult if they're teaching online. So chunking information is absolutely a key success factor for teaching online. Another one is build in formative assessment, build in foresight assessment. Here is the task, young people. How do you think you're going to perform this task in the next half an hour? How do you think is it going to be very difficult for you? Do you think you're going to manage it? Build in cooperative learning. For Zoom, which I think we're using now, the breakout rooms are absolutely fundamental success story with Zoom. So to that question, there are solutions, and there are quite many solutions, but I don't have the time now to list them. Thank you for the question.
okay, well, let's go with the second one. What will be the ideal ratio between face-to-face classes and virtual classes?
Right. So we're talking about after COVID, AC.
Yeah, after COVID too.
After COVID, which is going to come very soon. It's going to come soon. With all this positive energy, we can make it come soon, I hope. Young people in the big cities of the world, as we said earlier, are spending some 30, 40, 50 hours a week using digital devices. That's more time than they spend in school. What we need to do is to explore things like flipped learning, which is a funny name, but it's a very sensible method. We need to give more responsibility for the students to bring the world into the school. We need teachers to be able to relax and give responsibility to students to use their digital knowledge of the outside world and to bring it to school in various ways. It is done, it can be done, and I think it's a very successful formula. You know, one of the things that frustrates people about the Finnish success in education is that they find that the actual contact time in school is one of the lowest in the OECD. And they hear stories that in Finland there is no homework. These are actually, one of these is a myth, and that one is about homework, because when you look at the Finnish system, it's based on a lot of collaboration between young people. So let's say 10% of the curriculum is where they are collaborating. Now, if they are collaborating on the football field or through cyberspace, it doesn't really matter, they're collaborating. So I would say a possible hybrid percentage, which is a really difficult question to answer for secondary level students, is around 10%. Gustavo, just one thing about this. We have got a rise in the depression levels of young people on a scale we haven't seen before. It doesn't seem to be to do with diagnosis. It doesn't seem to be doing with identification. We have a serious problem with the depression levels of young girls and boys in our European countries. Now, why is that happening? Maybe one reason why it's happening is because of the pressure of living in the digital world. And ironically, you're surrounded by all your Instagram friends and Twitter friends or whatever, but ironically, it can make people more lonely. Therefore, the school after COVID is the one that actually accelerates the human teacher contact with the students. But it has to be done. Yeah, it has to be done in a different way from before, because some of our systems, the schools are very stressful. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of discipline and control, even with young adults, and that should basically stop. So essentially, it's not just a matter of the percentage, it's a matter of changing certain aspects of the culture, but maybe 10% would be a safe figure. Thanks for the question.
Okay, that's a big problem. You are right. A lot of times with depression. In Spain is the same.
It's the figures are particularly high for females.
Yeah. So the next question is, how can we make the students excited about learning English? You can play Netflix or you can see movies in English.
Okay, well, whoever asked that question, it's very close to my heart. And for some reason, it's taken me by surprise. I don't know why, because I'm supposed to be an expert in this area.
Yeah, I don't know too, but if we can pass another question.
No, it's a great question, but I could try and answer it with a little bit of science, which is not new, okay? You can't learn, okay, if you take 100 people, they will not successfully learn English if it is taught as a subject, if it is taught as rules of grammar, if it is taught as something where you have to learn words and then you're tested. If you learn English in that way, there is no context. Now, geography, physics, chemistry, they all have context. So why, after all these years of listening to all these brilliant people who for decades have explained to us that the way to learn English is to have a kind of, I use the word immersive, but you need to combine the learning of English with genuine content, and you need to push the students. Vygotsky, the ZPD, Zone of Proximal Development. So I would say to the person who kindly asked the question, have a look at the work of Stephen Krashen, have a look at the work of Vygotsky, have a look at the world of CLIL. I mean, CLIL emerged precisely to revolutionize the way that we teach and learn other languages. It wasn't just about English. So there are solutions, and it relates to integration.
Okay. So the next one, we have time. So it is important to a student, to turn on their cameras during a video lesson. Does it impact their learning?
Oh gosh, this is a tricky one, because if I were teaching these students, I would want to have the cameras on, because if the cameras are off, there's so much temptation for them to completely disconnect. Even if they're on, they can disconnect. So I think, personally, I think the cameras should be on. If I were teaching, I would need to see the cameras on. One of the problems now with COVID, one of the 12, and you can actually see these 12. They are on my website, which is out there, and there's a PowerPoint there which contains these 12. One of them is called cognitive fog. If you're teaching a class of young people and you're looking at their faces, you know when Gustavo has missed a point and he's looking a bit lost. You know when Maria has suddenly got an idea which she can share with the other girls, Millie, Molly, and Mandy. You can read, teachers read the faces of these young people. When you're teaching remotely, it's very hard to read the faces of the young people. And so cognitive fog is when a student misses a point because the dog walked in, because their father was making some coffee and being noisy, and they're sitting in the home, and it creates a lot of problems. But I think the cameras need to be on in order to at least try and have that human engagement And in so doing, we cannot teach the amount that we were teaching in school remotely. We should not try to force too much in. And you know, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you look at curricula, some curricula are so full of stuff that teachers have to teach. Yeah. And actually, that is one of the worst things you can do to a wonderful teacher, and it's one of the worst things you can do to a wonderful student, is saying we've got to pack all this information into the mind. And it comes back to, that's about developing crystallized intelligence. That's actually yesterday. What I need to do is to have my students developing fluid intelligence, and that means problem solving. So with the remote teaching, cameras on, group work continuously, and pass the challenge. Make it a game. Pass the challenge to those students to work collaboratively. Sorry, it was a pathetic answer, but it's quite a difficult question, and thank you for the question.
That's not really. So, Samantha Olvera saying, my question has to do with what would the new basic competence be? I'd love to hear about the core competence systems thinking. Thanks for that, from Mexico.
Samantha from Mexico, hi. On the I think it's the 22nd of October, the OECD are releasing a long study about what are global competencies. And what I like about the OECD global competencies is that they're very, very simple. The actual basic framework is very, very simple, and they're very smart. So there are certain competencies which are absolutely essential. And one of the most powerful now, and you just have to look north, Samantha, at the chaos in the United States, or Gustavo, look north to the chaos in the United Kingdom, two English-speaking countries, which appear to be imploding at the moment. You have a lot of people living in those countries who have the vote, but who clearly cannot distinguish fact from fiction. In other words, people who have not been educated to become autonomous, responsible adults. So critical thinking is one of the core things that we absolutely have to give to young people to help them stay safe in the world and to help the world stay safe as well. But OECD global competences is where I would go, because I think it's the tidiest approach to answering your question. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to make the last question. And if you want, people are asking about your contact information, I mean, email or your webpage. So if you want, at the end of the session, you can give the webpage, the website, sorry, and then they can write you, send you an email or something.
Can I just answer that now? It's very simple. It's David Marsh, davidmarsh.education.
Okay,
davidmarsh.education, and you can find it there. But thank you for showing interest. I thought everybody was asleep because I can't see any of you. You see, I'm teaching. I'm looking at Gustavo. Sometimes I'm thinking there is nobody there but Gustavo. But anyway, we're having a good time. What was the last question?
The last question is, yeah, that's an interesting question from Sabrina Gallego. How would you work with the students without internet access at home?
Sabrina, yeah, thank you for that question. What we've seen in the pandemic is that the percentage of young people who do not have internet access is huge, is absolutely huge. For many, many reasons. It could be that the access is too weak. It could be that their parents don't allow them to have it, and so on and so on and so on. So I think the only way to try to solve this, well, it depends. I mean, I work in places where the teachers are now providing food to the students and checking that they're okay in their homes. They don't have internet access at all, but the role of the teacher during the crisis has revealed the deep inequities in our societies, deep. So this issue of not having internet access is profoundly important. How you solve it, I have no solution. What I know is that there are ways to solve it, and it could even be printing some materials, taking those materials to the local shop, the grocery shop in a village, in the countryside, in a country, having the parents or the children being able to pick those materials up from the shop, right? Because this is a COVID situation, so everything is chaos. But then finding ways to use physical ways to maintain the educational possibilities of the child. And one of those is to set projects. So for example, if the child is on a farm in a remote place, you actually set a whole project where the child investigates the farm around them through a different lens, to working with the animals or to sitting in school learning about biology. So the question is a very tough one, and we have got to be creative. And the way to be creative is to reach out and share with each other what is happening. It's not to be sitting necessarily listening to experts who are not actually in your environment, but it's a desperate situation, and desperate measures are needed. Yeah, but I do appreciate the question. Thank you.
Well, David,
it's been quite a marathon.
It has been a pleasure. It has been a pleasure spending this time with you. Thank you very much to be with us. Muchísimas gracias a todos los asistentes. Siento no tener más tiempo para preguntas. Sé que tenéis muchas preguntas para David. They have a lot of questions for you, but we don't have time enough. But sure, they can contact you. By the webpage, by the website. David Marsh.
Education. That's it.
Education. Sorry.
David Marsh. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Take care, and maybe we'll meet one day somewhere out there. And if we do, just tell me you were in this event, because I can't see anybody, and I still wonder if I'm only talking to Gustavo. But thank you so much. Thank you, Gustavo, and good night.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye.